um, for our two speakers. Those of you who have attended before know that through those seminars, we're supporting researchers to share research findings and research knowledge across HSE and with partner organisations. And we're particularly trying to share examples of how to get research into practice. So before we start, I want to remind you of the resources that are available to support you in using your research knowledge, including guidance and training modules. And we've put a link into the chat to the R&D website and to the resources that are on the website for anyone who'd like to use them. If anyone experienced any technical difficulties during the session, you can rejoin the seminar by phone, and the details of how to do so are in the chat function. I'm Virginia Minogue, one of the workstream leads for knowledge translation and impact, and I have some of my colleagues from the team also on the call, Gethin White, who's sharing us this morning, and Mary Morrissey. So we're very fortunate to have two very experienced and knowledgeable speakers with us today with two very important topics. We've got Sarah Barry from the RCSI and formerly from Trinity College Dublin, talking about the evaluation of the implementation of Slaintecare. And we've got Suzanne Guerin from University College Dublin School of Psychology, who's going to be talking to us about knowledge translation and how to effectively engage in knowledge translation. So each of our speakers will be given a presentation, and after each one, we'll have an opportunity to ask any questions. You're going to be muted during the call, so please submit your questions in the chat function. And when you add a question to the chat, please make sure that you send your question to the panelists, and you can put your questions in at any point during the presentations. I want to let you know that we're recording the presentations and they'll be available on the website sometime after the event. So in a change to the order, we're going to go with our first speaker this morning, Suzanne Guerin from University College Dublin School of Psychology. And Suzanne is one of the developers of the evidence-based model for the transfer and exchange of research knowledge, also known as EMTReK. And Suzanne's going to be talking to us about how to maximise impact with effective knowledge transfer using EMTReK. And EMTReK is one of the suggested models that we have included in the HSE process for knowledge translation. So Suzanne, you're very, very welcome. We're very pleased to have you today talking to us. So if you want to share your presentation, that would be lovely. Thank you.
Thank you, Virginia, and thank you for the opportunity to be here and to talk about EMTReK. I am going to hopefully effectively share my screen now. Can I just check that everyone can see that? I hope that's okay. Okay, so as I said, I'm delighted to be here to talk about our model EMTReK. And as Virginia said, I'm one of a number of people who worked on the development of this model with the support of the All Ireland Institute for Hospice and Palliative Care, who had funded this project, which was led by myself and Professor George Kernahan from Ulster University. So I suppose I want to start just by explaining my language. So we positioned this project in the context of the concept of KTE, knowledge transfer and exchange. And terms like knowledge translation, knowledge mobilization are all used in this space. And it's really important to be comfortable with the different meanings that are there. And in my understanding, knowledge translation is part of this broad activity. But in our work, we identified this quote by Kiefer et al., which was cited by Mitten, which defined knowledge transfer and exchange as an interactive exchange of knowledge between research users and research producers. And we really liked the capturing of that dynamic interaction. And its purpose is, as Virginia touched on there, is to increase the likelihood that research evidence will be used in policy and practice. and but also recognizing again that it's a two-way interaction. It's also about helping researchers to identify practice and policy relevant questions. So from the outset, we liked that this was an interactive focus. And the context that we were conscious of was the multiple factors that highlight the importance of effective and efficient knowledge transfer and exchange. So for those of us who are working in the very broad area of applied research, and obviously health services and health related research fits within that, the growth of the concept of implementation science, actually looking explicitly at what maximizes that impact, how do we implement knowledge, quality improvement generally within health settings and the impact agenda, and also changes in dissemination and science communication. I think we're living at a time when the communication of scientific knowledge is really recognized as important, and in some ways the sort of growth of discussions around COVID-19, the development of the vaccine, really brought science communication to the fore. So that's the broader context. And at the same time, the nature of communication, whether it's of science or other things, has changed. And for someone who's been in academia for a number of years, there's a lot of channels and challenges out there around dissemination. So for those of us doing research, the idea that open access publication is now a real priority means we're encouraged to think about how we can use that in the best interests of communicating our research. Journals offering multimedia abstracts so that someone can click onto the journal website, and instead of reading the 150 words we're all used to, that they'll see an engaging video of the author of the paper talking about their paper. Other routes to dissemination other than traditional academic journals, so writing policy or practitioner briefs, blogs. I'm a big fan of the RT Brainstorm platform. If you're not familiar with it, you can check it out online. But also the popular media and social media as platforms for science communication. Where that leaves us is that any dissemination activity has to focus on multiple channels. You can't, the day of the researcher thinking about the peer-reviewed journal publication or the tome of an organizational report really has moved on. So within that context, we have to recognize multiple activity. And I want to start with an example of a project that engaged this. We were very lucky to work with Dr. Kathy Payne on our project, and Kathy is a very experienced researcher and communicator of research. But this was her PhD project, which she developed and implemented and disseminated prior to EMTReK existing. But I think what this slide captures is Kathy's recognition and activity around multiple channels of dissemination, whether it be guides for the project, whether it be having the peer-reviewed publications, having the conference presentations, but also being active on social media. And one thing, and it may seem very simple, that I think this slide highlights is the importance of naming a project and how we name it to give an identity. So the April project really was something that could catch someone's imagination and attention. And I should say that Kathy did all of this fantastic work before EMTReK existed. And I think that's one thing I want to say about our project, is that in many ways we were tasked with developing a model to support transfer and exchange of research knowledge. There is and was at the time that we started this project a lot of information out there about knowledge transfer, knowledge mobilization, knowledge translation. But what we were tasked with was finding a framework that would guide researchers and practitioners and policymakers to be more effective and efficient in this area. And this is the fantastic team that myself and George had the pleasure of working with on this project. And so I want to start by saying two things. One, there's really nothing new in the elements that are in the EMTReK model. And actually it's based on a systematic review of existing health services research. So we wanted the framework to be clearly evidence-based so that we could disseminate it on the basis of its validity as an evidence-based model. So it was developed based on a comprehensive systematic scoping review, which gathered together 79 articles that presented aspects of knowledge transfer and exchange in health services research broadly. And we synthesized that in order to identify what we lovingly called EMTReK, and as Virginia introduced there, it's the evidence-based model for the transfer and exchange of research knowledge. This is EMTReK. It is a model that has 6 components. 3 relate to the message that is being disseminated, the stakeholders related to that dissemination, and the process of dissemination or communication involved. And within each of those areas, we had identified a number of components of related to those activities. The model recognizes important contextual features, both the local context of dissemination, whether that be, as you can see, the organization in which this is happening or the organizations to whom the knowledge is relevant, but also the wider sociocultural and economic context. And an important component of EMTReK is the importance of evaluating your activity. So what we wanted this framework to offer was a way to think and plan dissemination, communication, all of the activities that relate to transfer and exchange of research knowledge. And in 20 minutes, it's not possible to highlight all of the components of EMTReK. So I would draw your attention to our website, which is kindly hosted by the Palliative Hub, which was developed by the Institute. But actually, if you Google or actually enter into your search engine knowledgetransfer.ie, it brings you directly to our page on the Hub, where there are a number of resources. And what I want to focus on is the way in which those resources are used. So just as an example, on the website, you will find a glossary. And really, the importance of the glossary is to help you to think about these components of the model. So I've taken one just as an example, the message component. And again, this is about the importance of recognizing the messages that research creates, but also recognizing that any research project has multiple messages. And those messages are relevant at different times for different reasons. So obviously a researcher may have research findings that they want to disseminate, and they want to break down what the messages of those findings are. But even before a researcher has findings, a researcher may want to recruit participants. And because of that recruitment, they need to share messages about their study that don't relate to the findings. And they need to convey those messages in a way that is meaningful and engaging and generates the attention and the participation that they're designed to do. So the message isn't just about the findings of research. It can be about the nature of the research, but it can also be about the implications of the research. And particularly when we're thinking about maximizing the impact of research, there are messages for practitioners and policymakers and other researchers that need to be disseminated. So within that aspect of the model, the message, there are a number of subcomponents or operational elements and things to think about and to plan for. So even just to take one example, the knowledge is credible. A few moments ago, I told you that EMTReK was an evidence-based model. And I told you about the systematic review, the comprehensive systematic review that was used to generate the model. That is me reassuring you of the credibility of the model. And that's part of our messaging. When we want to communicate the findings of research, the implications for policy and practice, it's really important that we can reassure the audience why they should actually listen to this and why they should take this information on board. So making sure that you reinforce that the knowledge you are sharing has been created by a rigorous, credible and trustworthy process is an example of me implementing the EMTReK model. And as you'll see, there's 4 other components to messaging. And what we would encourage researchers and practitioners and policymakers to do is that when they are planning a project, from the very beginning, they need to be reflecting on the activities that will support ultimately the exchange of that knowledge. Another resource that's available on the website is our EMTReK process chart. And what the process chart aims to do is to be a point of guiding your reflection. So it has the model in the center, and it gets the researcher, again, or the practitioner or policymaker, to think about the why of the transfer, the dissemination, the communication, the what, the who, the how, and the when. And as you'll see from that little note up in the top right-hand corner, we really stress that this process is not linear. It is an ongoing interactive exchange across the lifetime of the project. It does require planning and consideration from the outset, but it also requires adaptation and consideration over the course of the project as the findings evolve, as challenges arise. Perhaps there's been problems with recruitment and you need a drive to raise awareness of the project. So this process chart, while it has numbered 1 to 5, the why, what, who, how, when, it's really important to recognize that particularly those aspects of message, stakeholders, and process of KTE really do interact with each other. So certain messages will be relevant to certain stakeholders at different points of a project's lifespan, and the process by which you can best support the transfer of that knowledge will vary. And again, it's about explicit consideration to this process from the outset. Now, one of the things that we suggest is the best way to operationalize this is a KTE plan, or sometimes called a dissemination plan. And that is thinking from the outset what you're planning to do. And what's been fantastic in the last few years is the way in which research funders like the HRB, the HSE, and others have begun asking for those plans at the point of application for funding to get researchers thinking. Now, we were very keen within EMTReK to live the message, and so all of these resources are available online, and the publications themselves, with the exception of the original protocol, are all open access. So you can access knowledgetransfer.ie and access those. The other really exciting development, which really I can't give enough praise to the Institute for their work in doing this, was the development of an online training module, which is uses the EMTReK model and walks anyone taking it through the process of developing a dissemination strategy. It's a freely accessible training program. It is hosted by the Palliative Hub, but you can join the hub and access the module itself. And there's lots of resources there. And again, we wanted to make sure that there was a living, breathing set of accessible resources to really provide as much support as we can for those interested in developing a really effective dissemination strategy and knowledge transfer plan. Now, I was very keen to talk, I suppose, in more specifics about how EMTReK can be used. And it was really difficult to think of a perfect project to talk about. But actually, this is a very recent activity, a knowledge transfer and exchange activity that I had the absolute joy to be involved in, which was very much informed by EMTReK. So I am working with a number of fantastic colleagues in the oncology space, colleagues from St. James's Hospital, Crumlin Hospital, DCU, and here in UCD, to look at aspects of psychosocial needs of adolescents and young adults with cancer. So this is the 15 to 24 age group, a group that can sometimes fall between children's and adult services. And we know from the research that there's a lot of unique experiences within these groups that may have implications for their experience of cancer. So we have been working in this space for a number of years. We have partnered with Barrettstown for many years to conduct research on their programs for children and families with cancer. And we also had been invited to begin to develop some young adult programming with Barrettstown. So we wanted to begin this piece of research, in this new piece of research on AYAs, in a meaningful way, but in a way that was most likely to have an impact. So we were very lucky to be funded by the Irish Cancer Society for an engagement event. And the aim with the engagement event was to bring together a group of key stakeholders in this space to share with them the research that had been done previously around Barrettstown's programming, and particularly the model of therapeutic recreation that they implement and the programs that they deliver, and to actually have an active discussion with those stakeholders about what are the recommendations for meeting the needs of adolescents and young adults that come from the research that has been done so far by Barrettstown and the experience within that group. So just before Christmas, we were able to bring together a group of 20 stakeholders for a consensus workshop. So using EMTReK, we identified interactive processes that would be more likely to generate meaningful and achievable recommendations, both for research and practice. We wanted to look at the implications of the existing research and the future research questions that would need to be asked to provide supports to this particular group. And in that group that we were able to bring together, we had young people, professionals from multiple disciplines, researchers from multiple settings, and policymakers from the HSE, the Chief Nursing Officer's Office, and also some of the advocacy groups in the cancer space and ICS as well. And what I've just shared with you were the notes from the consensus workshop, where we would present the findings of a particular project and then in small groups discuss what are the practice implications and what are the future research questions. And I mean, this is a tiny snapshot of the output of that event. And the aim is to synthesize the output from that event, again, with those stakeholders to actually guide the next steps for this research and the next steps for practice. And all of that was pulling together elements of that EMTReK model. Again, thinking about the messaging of the day, thinking about the need for interaction and meaningful interaction, making sure that we had the users, the producers of the knowledge in the room. So this was a really successful event, and while Barrettstown had been closed due to snow in the days before, we were delighted to bring people together. So this is just a snapshot of how you might use EMTReK, but I think the key thing is it's about explicitly using it. So I'm conscious of time, and I'm just going to conclude with a few key messages, and then absolutely happy to take some questions. So I think the starting point for my conclusions is that research impact is driven by a dynamic process of activity over the lifetime of any project. For an academic like me, who's been in research for 20 years, the starting point of my career focused on peer-reviewed publications in reputable journals, and that has completely changed. Research impact is only achievable when there is clear effort put into engaging and impactful communication from the beginning to end of a project. And I think those of you on this call will be much more familiar with that mentality than with the more old-fashioned approach to peer-reviewed publications. A key thing is that we need to develop dissemination and communication plans from the very start. A lot of researchers react to EMTReK and say, well, I can't disseminate my findings at the beginning of a study. That's a narrow focus on the findings of a study. Communication around research is about more than just the findings, and it can be as simple as about generating awareness of a project or generating participation in a project. There is definitely a need to think about using multiple media and multiple channels so that you can reach different stakeholders, and that this will increase the likelihood of maximising your impact. And we hope that the EMTReK model, as one of many resources that are out there, but as if I can be so bold, our favourite can actually be a practical and meaningful tool to support this process, and that the resources available on knowledgetransfer.ie are accessible and usable to an audience. So thank you for your time. Thank you for the opportunity to talk with you about EMTReK. I've got my email address there and my Twitter handle. If anyone would like to reach out to me outside of today's event, that I'd be delighted to talk with you. But for now, I'm happy to respond to any questions.
Thanks so much, Suzanne. That's an excellent insight into how we can increase impact and also use the EMTReK to much better effect than we're perhaps doing at the moment. So we've got a couple of questions in. We've got a comment. Thank you, Suzanne. Lots of food for thought. Looks like a very useful model to bear in mind when planning research. And I think you did emphasise the planning process, didn't you, Suzanne? And so there come a couple on messaging and skills for messaging. And so what can help researchers develop the different messages about their findings for the different stakeholder audiences?
Regina, I think that's really important, because in some ways, if you are a group of researchers and you are looking at your project and you are thinking about what those different messages may be, you may be coming from a slightly limited perspective. I think really bringing in representatives of those stakeholder groups to help you to isolate those messages is really essential, and doing that from the very beginning. And what's wonderful, and I didn't mention it in my slides, but the growth of public and patient involvement, and in fact what I call PPPI, public, patient and professional involvement in research, gives us a mechanism by which from the very beginning we can be hearing different voices about what may be important about a project, so that when you get to having findings and you're starting to think about who do I need to discuss these findings with, that you have that mix of voices. On a practical level, I worked with an organisation, CDI, and TALA, Childhood Development Initiative, and for every research project that was done within that organisation, there was a reflection group before the report was finalised. And the reflection group involved bringing the researchers together with representatives of those stakeholder groups to share the report and to discuss who should hear about this report. Who should we reach out to? And that was a common part of any project that CDI implemented. So on that basis, it's a very, that's a very simple example of how you can be open to different audiences being interested in different messages.
And that was one of the questions I was going to ask you, actually, Suzanne, in relation to patient and public involvement. I suppose twofold question about PPI in knowledge translation activity. We talk about integrated knowledge translation. I wonder, how much you've had PPI involved in your KT activity and also in the EMTReK development. And was there any PPI involved in that?
There was, so one of our papers from the project is a series of case studies of the use of the model, and we were actually one of the case studies, which was a little intricate because it was very sort of self-reflective. But when we had an early version of the findings of the systematic review, the Institute supported us to bring together a group of stakeholders, which would have included representatives of Voices for Care, which is the user and carer forum that the Institute supports and works with. We would have had, again, researchers, practitioners and policymakers. And in, again, a very sort of open forum, we had a series of workshops where we presented the elements of EMTReK as they were at the time, and actually the name didn't exist. We presented elements of the model at a very early stage, and we got groups brainstorming the language we were using, the relevance of it, the accessibility of it, whether we were missing anything. And in fact, so that event was part of our case study of how we used EMTReK to revise EMTReK. It's very circular, but we really wanted to have, and again, PPPI, that we wanted public, patient and professional involvement in honing this tool so that it was better positioned to be impactful.
And I know you mentioned that it developed in palliative care, but am I right in thinking that you're using it beyond palliative care now? Yeah.
Exactly. So it was funded in palliative care, but the systematic review was of health services research broadly. So because of that, we're absolutely confident that it can be implemented. So again, the online program hosted on the hub is for health research. We're using it in a number of projects. I suppose I can be accused of living and breathing it in many ways because it's part of what I do now, but it's been taken on board in a number of international projects as well, again, in that broad health services space. So, and I think the feedback I've had anecdotally is that when people in that health space engage with it, that actually it doesn't feel like it's just for palliative care. And we wanted something that would be relevant for palliative care because that's where the funding was coming from, but could be used more broadly.
Yeah. So just one final question because we are running out of time. Just quickly, if I can ask you, one of the questions we've got in the chat is how can researchers develop the skills for marketing their research so that findings get disseminated better?
Yeah, Virginia, I worry that sometimes researchers may be expected to have all the skills, and I think realistically when it comes to dissemination communication, and we chose that word marketing very intentionally because it is a very particular type of communication. One of the very early colleagues within the institute who was appointed to work on knowledge transfer actually came with a marketing background. And I think that's one of the things to recognize is that we can't expect researchers to have all these skills, but we can encourage them to engage with the people who do have these skills, whether it be graphic designers or people with expertise in communication. Here in UCD, we have a communication department that I might reach out to occasionally to get some guidance. We can't hold all those skills, but I think having an awareness that there are important skills that we might want to include in our planning for a project or even in our budget for a project recognizes that the best way to bring those skills to the table is to bring those skilled people to the table.
Thank you. That's a really important message. So thanks very much again, Suzanne. I think we've learned lots today, particularly about the planning process in terms of, maximising the impact from our research. So that's really, really helpful. So thanks very much. Thank you. So I want to welcome our second speaker, Sarah Barry. Sarah is going to be talking to us about the evaluation of the Slaintecare implementation process. So Sarah, I think somebody's trying to share your slides.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
Good
Do you
morning,
want to start to introduce yourself?
I will, of course. Yeah, absolutely. That's great. Thank you, Gethin or Mary. I think it's Mary who's sharing them, so I'll give you a prompt to just pass it on each time. Just to mention that I've just very recently, last week, joined the RCSI, but a lot of the work I will be drawing on comes from work completed with colleagues in Trinity College Dublin, Sarah Burke, Steve Thomas, Reka Searsbeck, Gosha Stack, and PJ Harnett, of course, from the HSC. For some reason on the screen there, it's blocking out the Trinity logo, but that's absolutely not intentional. Yeah, the work is very much based in work that's been done through my time in Trinity. So maybe we could just pass to the next slide, Mary. Okay, thanks. Looks like we've a little bit of a grey block on each of the slides, but we'll forge on. Hopefully it's not going to be too much of a problem. So just to say really that, thank you, that's disappearing. So just to say that, as I said, I've joined the College of Surgeons, but I want to highlight in this slide that my interest has been for some time in terms of integrated care. And in terms of Slaintecare, I was involved with the team. I was part of the team that worked with the Joint Oireachtas Committee on in preparing the Slaintecare report back in 2017. And have really been involved since then, working with Sarah Burke and Steve and other colleagues in terms of the Foundations project to look at Slaintecare implementation. So Slaintecare is something that I've been attending to and watching closely for quite some time. Mary, next slide, thank you. Hopefully that'll work there now. A few little teething problems this morning. What the next slide is about, and hopefully it'll click on there in a moment, is that we are, I want to start by focusing on what is Slaintecare all about. What is the focus of it? We seem to have lost graphics there. We might get them. Yeah, we can run it like this, Mary, if it makes life easier, okay? But anyway, I want to focus on what Slaintecare is all about. And essentially, it's about universal health care. And what I've put up there on the slide is the cube. This is the WHO format for thinking about universal health care. And I just wanted to remind us of that, because that's at what the heart of what Slaintecare is all about. And it's very easy to lose sight of the main focus. As you can see there, universal healthcare is defined by the WHO, comes in kind of three core elements, which is what's called the population access. So who is covered? How much of the population are covered to get access to healthcare? And then secondly, what's the basket of services? So which services are covered? And obviously in the Irish context, we might look at saying, well, within the public system, how much is covered, what is not covered, what kind of services are available. We'll say a little bit about that in the next slide. And then finally, the cost access, which really highlights, well, how many people are protected within that? How are they going to, if you like, how are those services going to be funded? Is it going to be at the point of access? Is it going to be through health insurance, etc.? What are the various different ways in which that funding and those costs are going to be covered? So that's kind of the way we think about universal healthcare from a technical side. And in a sense, if you look at Slaintecare and some of the planning documents, we've got this tagline: right care, right place, right time. So this is, if you like, trying to make sure that all these mechanisms are in place, that we've got the right kind of coverage of the population, we've got the right basket of services, and that we have a way of covering those costs. Thanks, Mary. We can go to the next slide. Now, obviously, in the Irish context, it doesn't fit into this beautiful cube. And this is because we have very much a two-tier system. Two different, there's a kind of a substantial access through private healthcare, private health insurance, and also we have the complication of a lot, up to 20% of private care can be delivered through our public system, particularly in the tertiary setting. And this particular graphic here is from a paper that Sarah Burke led on, and I worked with other team members on, trying to understand how we could move through towards the universal healthcare system. It's quite an old paper at this stage, but you can see that, the Irish system is very, very complicated and just does not neatly fit into this kind of cube structure. Thanks, Mary. We'll go to the next slide. What it highlights is this, high complexity in the Irish system. Now, just going into Slaintecare itself for a moment, you can just see what are the substantial pieces. So it falls in, obviously, there's a population health approach, which is the first chapter of the report, which kind of sets the broader context, the demographic context, which has been very much in the news this week due to our, ED and waiting list problems, etc. But you can see here that it falls in under four key chapters or four kind of approaches. One is to expand the entitlement. So this is that population coverage expansion. And then the kind of what is the kind of form of care that we want to deliver? What does that basket of services look like from a quality perspective? And what we're aiming for is an integrated approach to healthcare delivery, as you can see here, at the lowest level of complexity, and various enablers to make that happen. And then also, under funding, that there would be ring-fenced health fund, that we would be going through for what's called, in the document was called Regional Integrated Care Structures, or RICOs, now being talked about as Regional Health Areas, or RHAs, and then to take the private care out of the public system. And then importantly, and we'll come back to this in a subsequent slide, is that there's a whole chapter on implementation in there in the report. And the Oireachtas committee at the time were very highly focused on the idea that, you know, this should be under the Taoiseach's remit, you know, high priority and have a very, very strong chance of implementation. And where the office, or if you like, the governance to drive that implementation would sit, has been and continues to be a challenging element of implementing Slaintecare to this day. I just noted here, we're moving on in May, it'll be 6 years since the report. So I'm not sure about the 10-year time frame. But still in all, it is an all-party report and does have general, you know, if you like, at least in principle, buy-in, and is indeed the direction of the health system reform, no matter how it unfolds. Thank you, Mary. Next slide. Okay, just very briefly to highlight that this graphic never made it into the report, but it was the overall design that drove how the report came together. And you can see here you've got these 4 pieces together: the entitlements, the integrated care, the funding, the implementation, all underpinned with a population health approach. And the whole idea was that it would be a whole of system or a whole of process approach. In other words, that we couldn't cherry pick certain elements, because obviously, just to give one key example, if you increase entitlements, so you increase that kind of basket of services and the population coverage, well, then it's going to have implications for the capacity of the system to deliver in terms of integrated care. Thanks, Mary. Okay, this is a very busy timeline. Hopefully you'll have the slides afterwards and you can look at it in a little bit more detail. I'm not going to go through it all, but it does show the progression of Slaintecare implementation as it is. And what I just want to highlight here, rather than kind of telling the whole story, and obviously we've got the big, you know, cut point there of COVID that in some ways changed a lot of things and put a lot of extra pressure on the system. But what I do want to highlight here is that this timeline tells a story, in my mind, of the challenge of trying to frame such a complex change as is kind of set out in the Slaintecare report from the Oireachtas back in 2017. We've got various iterations of planning documents, some integration with the HSE National Service Plans, and various other kind of key reports along the way. In many ways, the what I'm kind of terming the framing of Slaintecare implementation, I would suggest, you know, has followed, you know, a kind of a slow process. And that links in with the second challenge that I want to highlight, which is the challenge of governance. And you can see here in various kind of touch points of the story that we got, you know, Laura McGahey appointed as the Executive Director of Slaintecare Delivery, the Implementation Office sitting in the Department of Health. The Oireachtas committee had been very keen that it would sit in the Department of Taoiseach. That didn't happen. But then if you kind of hop along from there, we get in September 21, Laura McGahey and the chair of the advisory board, Tom Keane, resigning for the lack of pace of implementation and the difficulties with that. And then kind of more recently there, in February last year, there was, you know, a couple of Oireachtas health committee meetings in which Paul Reid and Robert Watt were kind of being challenged around the governance of the delivery and the implementation of Slaintecare, and why was it moving so slowly. So I just wanted to highlight with that slide that there are some key challenges, one of framing, another one of governance, which I think, you know, continues to this day, and then actually, you know, the buy-in and the understanding of how practically to deliver and implement such a complex change as is Slaintecare. I do just want to finish on this slide by saying we have, you know, the greatest budget, health budget ever at 23.4 billion. But we are in that classic situation of trying to deliver major health system reform whilst, you know, dealing with many crises you know, the classic winter ones, but actually, in fact, these are being pervasive or chronic challenges right through the whole year, you know, greatly increased by the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic. And, you know, in integrated care, we often use this kind of idea of trying to change the wheels on a moving car. And I think that that's very much the story of Slaintecare implementation, is the complexity of how is very, very challenging indeed. Thanks, Mary. If you could move on the slide. Okay, so I just wanted to pick up here on one of the kind of elements of how we have tried to frame Slaintecare implementation. So you can see in this kind of version of trying to frame what the change looks like across 4 work streams, that, you know, you're trying to move many parts at the same time. And, you know, it kind of highlights the challenge of buy-in, ownership, and indeed maybe understanding of what is Slaintecare, what is it all about. I'm going to focus as an example of some of this complexity on, I think it's 2.1 there, the RICOs as they were called in the early stages of implementation, or now the regional health areas. Okay, Mary, we can move on from there. Thank you. What you can see in this slide is I've just clipped in a whole load of things. We can see that we've got a sort of an accounting situation in terms of looking at the work plans. And, you know, if we look back at the report on progress there from a couple of months back in 2022, you know, it seems in many ways that a lot of it is on track. And you would, you know, say, well, actually, that's not too bad. But Mary, if you just click through some of the graphics that are following on here, we have a big budget. But then all of this challenge, and some right up to just earlier in the week, you know, the challenges with, you know, how on earth are, as the entitlement expansion kind of envelope is in place, the minister saying he's moving forward with this, and GPs kind of saying, well, how on earth are we going to have the capacity to deliver? Or my colleague Sarah Burke talking about overcrowding at the weekend being a symptom of failure to reform the health system. So whilst we have a budget and we have a plan, this kind of gnarly sort of challenge of actually trying to understand the mechanisms and how we engage people and finding the right path to implementation remains, you know, a chronic challenge. Thanks, Mary. So what I'm going to do is, because time is tight, and as you can see, it's an enormous agenda, I just want to focus on the one study that I led on through the Foundation's project. And this was on looking at the reorganisation of the health system over the last 30 years. This was something prompted by the Department of Health in light of moving towards regional health areas to try and understand what can we learn from the experience of the past. The whole idea, obviously, of the regional bodies is to try and align our acute and our community and primary care, kind of our different care domains. We've got hospital groups, we've got CHOs, which are not, you know, they don't really kind of link up in a kind of a management or administrative sense. And we're looking to kind of have a much more regionalised resource allocation and governance structures. And this is a very major structural change for our health service, which is very, very centralised. And obviously we need, you know, various new systems of accountability where integrated care can become a reality on the ground for both patients and the care providers. And obviously, you know, the whole need for this structural change is a recognition that the system that we currently have is unfit for purpose, primarily due to many problems, but primarily because our population health profile is changing. We're all living longer, our population of older people is growing, and we live longer with a range of chronic illnesses. Okay. So if we could just move on from that slide, a little bit about reorganisation, moving from what we've got to, you know, more regionalised healthcare delivery. It's essentially an institutional change, and institutions as a whole, you know, we're all in institutions that resist change. And it's, you know, it can be transformative, but it involves an awful lot of high stakes and you know, the need for strong, powerful leadership. I've just picked up on this quote here from Fergal Bowers. Is quite an old quote, but you know, talking about the RHA delivery, he highlights that really it has the impact to change the delivery of services enormously and people's experience of that, but actually involves major administrative reform. And you know, looking at major administrative reform is you know, it impacts on all of us in very concrete ways. Thanks, Mary. Okay, so I'm not going to go through this in detail in the interest of time, but just look at the questions that we were asking. We were trying to understand, well, how many reorganisations has the Irish system been through in the last 5 years? And what were they focused on? And how were they implemented? And what indeed were the outcomes from these various processes? So we just can move on to the next slide. So we highlighted, we identified 5 distinct service reorganisations, and Mary, you can click through the 5 of them there. The first one was actually moving from the health boards to what was called the Eastern Region Health Authority. And this was the beginning of actually trying to centralise the system. And then we kind of moved towards the HSE emerging after the Health Act in 2004. And then we've got this move towards directorates, hospital groups, and the creation of the community health organisations under Minister James Riley and the Future Health. And then we kind of move back again in terms of a system, the desire for a system for an integrated universal care in the Slaintecare report. So the main finding here was that actually since the early, you know, sort of 1990s, in many ways through some of the primary care policy documents, etc., we've been trying to deliver integrated care in one form or other, even though that language is probably more pertinent and to the fore in the discourse of health reform today. And in many ways, this is something that has challenged us greatly, but we actually haven't been able to achieve. Thanks, Mary. Okay, so integrated care has been a consistent focus of reorganisation and system reform policy, as I say, going right back to the 1990s. And the mechanisms by which we have tried to deliver that integrated care have been mainly structural. So we formed the HSE, the integrated service areas. Some of you might remember those. We formed hospital groups, community health organisations. But in many ways, a lot of these structural reforms have run out of steam due to a kind of an industrial, if you like, relations focus, you know, trying to work out, well, how will that work in practice? What does that mean for you know, each person in each care delivery unit, etc., etc., and that, you know, the process of implementation would kind of get caught up in that very, very important but low level detail, and somehow run out of steam. And actually, we found that there was little attention to the systemic and tacit mechanisms that really can drive reorganisational change. For example, creating a really, you know, proper integrated system of resource allocation, maybe workforce planning, of course, governance and leadership, but also then all the work in terms of engagement. And interesting listening to Suzanne earlier about how that engagement, that cultural change, that kind of understanding and buy-in is so important from the very beginning of any kind of a reform or, in fact, knowledge translation process, which in many ways you could characterise Slaintecare reform. So what came out of our study was a focus on implementation barriers. Thanks, Mary. Okay, so the barriers to implementation, no surprises here. I'm very conscious of time, so busy sort of a slide. You can read them through later, but basically we're looking at, you know, a lot of absence of leadership, you know, kind of, you know, fragmentation between the disciplines, failure to, you know, realize multidisciplinarity at scale, and indeed, you know, lots of management weaknesses and political interference in the reform process that takes time, and this kind of cherry picking challenge that often happens. Thanks, Mary. So what's missing for implementation? What we identified through this study of reorganisation over the last 30 years was the absence of a unified policy purpose, weak change management, just that poor transitioning. Reorganizational reforms, these 5 that we identified, were at times just abandoned, and particularly kind of highlighted in this case was the integrated service areas, as they were beginning to embed, and that some of the reorganizations seem more politically motivated. And I think the finger could be pointed here about the formation of the directorates under the James Riley leadership, etc., the abolition of the HSE board, etc. And that there is resistance from within the system, and in many ways has blocked progression. And indeed, I've noted in the papers this week some more harking back to that theme of saying, people not actually ready or embracing change. And therefore you get this loss of momentum and belief in the reform. Thanks, Mary. Next slide. Nearly there. So we did look briefly at what we could learn from other systems. And you know what, there's no rocket science here. It's hands-on leadership, right balance of political engagement, framing and timing really, really matters. There's no shortcut. So, this kind of reform complexity takes much longer than one government cycle. And then, an appropriate protection for the system as it is trying to change. So, no big surprises here, and I'm almost finished. Thanks, Mary. Okay, so what we needed to learn, the recommendations that we identified through this was that, it needs a clinical buy-in, that needs to be worked at. People need to believe in the changes, whilst in this case structural. It needs clear governance and management, and that the outcomes are clear for people fairly early on. The big move here is that people need to be engaged very, very early on, and that the system needs to be a system. So, the complexity of this kind of reform needs data, controls, hardware, etc., workforce planning. And it needs political leadership. So just to finish, I think if we started where I started, implementing Slaintecare and evaluating it, we don't have a big framework to evaluate it as yet, but I would say implementation has been slow, somewhat piecemeal. The governance continues to be unclear and very challenging. It needs leadership, but actually not reforming, not doing Slaintecare isn't really an option. Thanks, Virginia, and apologies for going right up to the line.
No, that's fine. Thanks very much, Sarah. That's a fascinating overview and insight into the implementation of Slaintecare. So thanks very much for that. So maybe just 1 or 2 questions. I am conscious of time, and people will be, I guess, going off to other meetings. We've got a few comments about fascinating timeline. What would you like to see happen next?
For me, I think if we could get the governance and some true leadership, and not just governance in terms of, obviously there needs to be political engagement. I noted that Sarah Burke was kind of laying the lack of leadership on this and commitment at the foot of the Taoiseach in her opinion piece at the weekend. But I think the governance and the leadership, and a clear implementation office, that's got teeth. I think that would be the, that's how Nye Bevan did it in the NHS all those years ago. I think that's what's the next step that's mostly needed.
Yeah, I was struck, Sarah, by the fact you said that weak or inconsistent implementation had been symptomatic of reforms, and you alluded to some of the learning that can be used to address that.
Yep, absolutely. And we have a paper there. I forgot to put the link on the slides, but the reorg paper is there available for anyone to read. It's on the HRB open access, but I can send on a link, Virginia, if that's helpful to share.
That would be great. Or if you just want to pop it into the chat now for people to see, that would be great.
Okay.
Well, thanks very much to both our speakers, Suzanne and Sarah. It's been a busy, fascinating and filled morning. They've given us some great insights into their respective projects. So thank you very much, and we'd be delighted to hear progress on your projects going forward. So thank you. So I want to thank both our speakers again for their excellent and informative presentations. I also want to thank Gethin White, who stepped in at a late stage to support us with this running of this event this morning. And obviously we've had some technical issues, so I apologise for anybody who's experienced some technical issues this morning. And also thank my colleague Mary Morrissey for her assistance this morning. Particular thank you to all of you who've attended. Our next seminar is going to be taking place on the 15th of March, and we're going to be focusing on women's health, and we're going to be hearing about the MAMI study and also the Labour hopscotch study. So thank you very much to everybody, and we look forward to welcoming you again in March. So thank you.